Matrubhumi. So let's welcome Avi Shlaim and Max Rodenbeck on stage for the session, Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab World. Max is South Asia's bureau chief for The Economist. He studied history in Egypt and roamed Middle East as a reporter. He authored a biography of the Egyptian capital, Cairo, the city victorious. And Max will tell us about Avi Shlaim's work, and he will take us through the session. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Oh, that's nice and loud, isn't it? Yeah. Fabulous. It's very nice to be here in a quiet morning after such a noisy day yesterday. I don't know how many of you were here yesterday, but it was quite intense. It's my great pleasure to be here with Avi Shlaim, who is an extremely distinguished historian and professor. I'll tell you briefly something about Avi, and then we'll get right down to question and answer a conversation between us, and then we'll open up to questions at the end. Avi was born in Baghdad, and then moved to Israel along with most of the Jewish community in Iraq in 1950, but then moved on to Britain when he was 16 years old, and went on to study history and international relations at the London School of Economics, University of Reading, and has been at Oxford since 1987, and is now Professor Emeritus at Oxford. Avi is considered one of this wave of so-called new historians, Israeli new historians, who began to re-examine the history of the creation of Israel, and had created some controversy in the process. His best-known book, and what we're sort of going to be focusing on a little bit, not just the book but also the theme, is his book The Iron Wall, which is a book about Arab-Israeli relations over the long haul from the creation of Israel until up to the present, and also the Israeli sort of policy of how to deal with the fact of being surrounded by hostile people. Back in 1897, as Avi says in his book, after the very first Zionist Congress in where was it? In Basel? No, in Basel. That's right, in Basel, 1897. When there was the idea of creating a Jewish colony, the Zionist colony in Palestine was sort of first pushed forward in a big way. There was a delegation sent off by the Jews of Vienna, the rabbis of Vienna, to explore how possible this was, and they actually sent back a note from Jerusalem, and the note said, "The bride is beautiful, but she is married to another man." And that turns out to be very true, of course, and that is the problem. I mean, that was problematic, wasn't it? So this is where we begin to see, the beginning of this whole issue. 25 years later, when the establishment of a Jewish colony in Palestine had moved several stages ahead, one of the sort of leaders of of one faction of Zionism, revisionist Zionism, Jabotinsky, came up with the idea or the notion of the Iron Wall as a way of dealing with the Arabs. So that's where that notion began. 1923, I think, was the first use of the Iron Wall. So that's where we're going to start. And so, Avi, I'd like to just jump right in. And can we first start with asking why you wrote this book? I mean, the book called The Iron Wall. What was the need for this book, and why did you write it?
Thank you. I wrote this book because I wanted to rebel against the Zionist narrative which was imposed on me after my family moved from Baghdad to Israel. So I was born in Baghdad in 1945 to a Jewish family, and we were Arab Jews. We spoke Arabic at home. Our culture was Arab culture. My parents' music was Arabic music. We were well integrated into Iraqi society. There were about 130,000 Jews in Iraq, and we had been there for 2.5 millennia since the Babylonian exile, and we had very good relations with our Muslim neighbors, and Iraq had a tradition of harmony between the different religious communities. And when we moved to Israel reluctantly, very much against our will, and the reason that we moved to Israel was the rise of nationalism in the interwar period, Arab nationalism, and also Zionist nationalism, Jewish nationalism or Zionism. And the Zionist movement gradually took over Palestine and displaced the Palestinians. So that was one reason for hostility on the part of the Arabs towards the Jews. In 1950, there was the mass exodus to Israel, and we were part of that. 120,000 out of 130,000 Jews, Iraqi Jews, ended up in Israel. And in Israel, I was given a new identity, an Israeli identity, and a new narrative, a Zionist narrative, which said that Israel is a peace-loving nation, is a peace-loving people who came to Palestine not to harm anyone or displace anyone, but to develop the country for the benefit of all its people. And when it came to the crunch in 1947, 1948, the Zionist movement accepted the UN partition of Palestine. The Arabs rejected it and went to war. And by a miracle, Israel survived that war. At the end of the war, Israel stretched out its hand in peace, but there was no one to talk to on the Arab side. So the official reason for the deadlock that persisted for 3 decades, the political deadlock, can be summed up in 2 words: Arab intransigence. And part of this narrative was that there was persecution of the Jews everywhere in the Arab world. Anti-Semitism was rampant throughout the Arab world. Palestinian nationalism was an extension of German anti-Semitism. And we were persecuted. We faced the threat of another Holocaust in the Arab world, and Israel offered us a safe haven. So I wrote this book as a rebellion against the narrative that was imposed on me. And I see my friend Lem Sisay in the audience. He wrote a memoir as well. And some of you may have been to the session on memoirs in which he talked about his memoir. So he's an Ethiopian boy in Britain. He was born in Britain, and his mother went back to Ethiopia, and he was taken care of by social services until the age of 18. And their narrative to him was that his mother rejected him. She didn't want to see him. And it was the opposite of the truth. So his memoir is a refutation of the official narrative, and so is mine.
And I think, among other things, you discovered subsequently was revealed that, like so many Jews from Baghdad, it was a series of bombings in Baghdad that actually prompted the exodus suddenly. And it turned out that actually these bombings had been committed by Israeli intelligence.
So this is... I've also nearly finished writing a memoir. And my memoir is called 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. And they cover my life up to the age of 18. the first 5 years in Baghdad, the next 10 years in Israel, and the last 3 years in London. And I've written 5 chapters of this memoir until I was born. So it's a family history set against the wider background of the Jews in Iraq. And my wife, who read what I had written, was worried that I'll never be born in this autobiography. And the most explosive chapter in this memoir is chapter 5, which I call Baghdad Bombshell, because in March 1950, the Iraqi government passed a law which said any Jew who wants to leave the country is free to do so. They have a year to register and then they can leave. Only 6,000 out of 130,000 Jews registered to leave. And in the next year, 5 bombs exploded in Jewish houses and businesses and one in a synagogue. And that created the panic that precipitated the mass exodus to Israel. And there have been persistent rumors that the Mossad was involved in these bombings. These rumors were strenuously and consistently denied by Israel, and there are 2 commissions of inquiry which exonerated Israel of any involvement. But all the Iraqis that I knew in Israel believed that the Mossad was involved and that they were tricked into leaving the country. And when I was researching my memoir, I met a friend of my mother. My mother is 95 years old. She lives in Ramat Gan. She's the main source for my memoir for the early period. And this friend of hers was in the Zionist underground. And he told me the full story in some detail. And the upshot is that a Jewish Zionist, a lawyer named Yusuf Basri, a very smart man and a very dedicated, committed Zionist, planted 4 of the bombs. And that his controller was a Mossad officer called Max Binet, who was based in Tehran. In those days, the Shah of Iran had very close covert relations with Israel, so the Mossad couldn't operate freely in Baghdad, but it could in
Tehran.
In Tehran. So this Mossad officer was the controller of Yusuf Basri. He gave him the information, the instructions, the map, and the TNT, the explosives. And so the Zionist underground, under direction from the Mossad, was responsible for 4 out of the 5 of the bombs. So I now have reached the conclusion that the exodus wasn't voluntary, it wasn't out of love of Zion, that it was instigated by the Mossad, and I describe that under the heading of cruel Zionism.
Thanks. Well, that's going to be a wonderful read. When I hope you do come alive in your memoirs and get to the end. But to get back to the subject of the Iron Wall, could you describe to us what is the Iron Wall? What is meant by that expression?
So, the architect of the strategy of the Iron Wall is Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the spiritual father of the Israeli right, and the mainstream Zionist leadership was labor leadership, Chaim Weizmann and David Ben-Gurion, and I see in the audience Tom Segev, who wrote a magisterial biography of David Ben-Gurion, and we had a session about his biography. But there was a right-wing opposition to the mainstream Zionist movement, and that was led by Ze'ev Jabotinsky. his movement was called revisionist Zionist. It was much more militaristic and much more expansionist. The mainstream labor movement wanted the partition of Palestine and a Jewish state, whereas the revisionist Zionists claimed the whole of mandatory Palestine, including Transjordan, which was part of the original mandate. And in 1923, Jabotinsky published an article called The Iron Wall, We and Our Neighbors. And this article was divided into two parts, an analysis of the problem and a program of action. And the analysis went roughly as follows. No people in history has ever willingly made room for another people to come and build a state on their land. The Palestinians are not a rabble, they are a people, and therefore they are not going to agree to the Zionists coming and establishing a state on their land. The only way to realize the Zionist project is unilaterally and by military force. A Jewish state can only be built behind an iron wall of Jewish military strength. The Arabs would hit their heads against the ramparts until eventually they would give up any hope of defeating the Jews on the battlefield. Then, and only then, will come stage 2 of the strategy, which is to negotiate with the Palestine Arabs about the rights and status in Palestine. So the Iron Wall was a twofold strategy. Stage 1 is building up military force, and stage 2 is negotiating from the Arabs from a position of unassailable military strength.
And did the strategy work?
The strategy worked just as Jabotinsky had predicted. Jabotinsky was a very sophisticated writer, thinker, and his strategy, his article, incorporated a subtle theory of change. He said that that there was nothing to talk about when the Jews were weak. A voluntary agreement is not possible. You can only achieve anything from a position of strength. So you have to build up your military strength and then negotiate. And my book, The Iron Wall, is first of all, I owe him the title, which is a nice, catchy title. But secondly, my book, The History of Israel, is a vindication of the strategy of the Iron Wall. First, Egypt under Sadat in 1979 signed a peace treaty with Israel from a position of palpable weakness. And that peace agreement between Israel and Egypt still stands today, despite all the turmoil, despite all the wars and everything that happened since then. So that's a success story. Then, in 1993, the Palestinians signed the Oslo Accord with Israel. They negotiated from a position of palpable weakness. In fact, that was the problem with the Oslo Accord, which we might come back to, that it was an agreement between a very powerful country and a very small movement, which reflected the balance of power of the two. The following year, in 1994, Jordan and Israel signed a peace treaty. So the strategy worked. Negotiations from strength work. The Arabs resigned to Israel as a sovereign, independent state in historic Palestine. But the problem is this, that Israeli leaders, especially leaders of the Israeli right, of the Likud, of people like Benjamin Netanyahu, fell in love with the Iron Wall, fell in love with Israel's military power, and didn't feel the need to negotiate or compromise.
And wasn't, I mean, to an extent, I mean, there's a sort of irony that Jabotinsky and his faction was the minority faction in the early years of Israel's history, but nevertheless, his strategy is the one that prevailed. And that was the strategy that was effectively carried out by every Israeli government from the foundation, the creation of Israel in 1948 until the present. Although his sort of ideological faction has been more or less in power in Israel for the last 20, 30 years now. But for the first half of Israel's existence, it was not in power. Even so, they carried out the same strategy.
That's a very, very important point that I make in the introduction to the Iron Wall, and that is that although the origins of the strategy was right-wing, it was adopted by the mainstream labor leadership, especially by Ben-Gurion. Not immediately, but gradually, because initially the labor Zionists said to Jabotinsky, your policy is immoral. You want to rely on military force. We believe in universal ideals of freedom, equality, democracy. And Jabotinsky wrote a second article on the morality of the Iron Wall. And there he turned on his critics and he said, you have to decide whether Zionism is a just cause or not a just cause. If you think it's a just cause, if you think it's a moral thing to do, a moral objective, then you have to take that to its conclusions and achieve it by any means. And if you don't believe in the justice of Zionism, then you might as well give up now.
Which is, I mean, there's a strong logic to that.
But Ben-Gurion adopted the logic of the Iron Wall.
Yes.
And Ben-Gurion started building up the military force of the Yishuv, of the pre-independence community in Palestine. And Tom Segev called his biography of Ben-Gurion a state at any cost. Is that right?
That's right.
A state at any cost. So this was the aim, and he would have paid any cost and used any means to achieve it. So there was no fundamental difference between Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky on the strategy. The difference was that in the territorial aims of the two movements. I was going to say mainstream labor Zionism was minimalist, but it wasn't minimalist. As Tom said, its aim was a Jewish state in as large a part of Palestine, with as many Jews as possible, and with as few Arabs as possible. But the Jabotinsky and the revisionists were territorial maximalists. They wanted not only the whole of Palestine from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, they claimed also Transjordan, which was part of the original mandate for Palestine. And the emblem of the revisionist Zionists was a map of the whole of mandatory Palestine with an arm holding a rifle which extended right across. And the slogan in Hebrew was Shte Gadot LaYarden, Zot Shelanu Zu Gam Ken. The Jordan River has two banks. This one is ours, and that one too. Just to sum up, so the Iron Wall was the basic Zionist strategy in the confrontation with the Arabs from the early 1920s until today.
And there's a clear, if your goal is to argue, is to negotiate from a position of strength, there's a question of where do you stop? When is strong enough? And this seems to have been a constant, problem in a sense that some of the policies that Israel adopted, for example, in the 1950s under Ben Gurion and later under various right-wing governments, seem to have pushed things to, not only do you have to negotiate from a position of strength, but you have to negotiate from a position where your enemy is completely humiliated. And that entails problems. For example, with as you suggested, with the Oslo Agreement with the Palestinians, there was such an imbalance in power. Could you explain something about that? And why did Oslo fail? What, in your opinion?
Yitzhak Rabin signed the Oslo Accord, and Yitzhak Rabin is the only prime minister in Israel's history who moved from stage 1 to stage 2 of the strategy. He was a military man, a very brutal military man who used force all his life. But during the first Intifada, he learned that there are limits to the use of military force and that you need to move forward towards the Arabs on the political plane. You need to find a political solution to a political conflict. So when the Labour was elected in 1992 and he had his term in power, he aspired to move to stage 2 of finding a peaceful solution with the Palestinians. And the result was the Oslo Accord. And the Oslo Accord, for all its limitations, achieved 3 things. Israel recognized the PLO as a representative of the Palestinian people. The PLO recognized the State of Israel, and the 2 parties agreed to settle their outstanding differences by peaceful means. And Oslo had many limitations, but it was nevertheless a historic breakthrough because it was the first agreement between the 2 principal parties to the conflict, the Palestinians and the Israelis. And Oslo was based, Oslo never mentioned the word a Palestinian state. Oslo did not call for a freeze on Israeli settlements on the West Bank. It was a terrible deal for the Palestinians, but that's the best they could get at the time. The hope was that they would acquire trust, they would acquire the habit of mutual cooperation, and things would move forward. So nothing was decided about the real difficult issues in the conflict, what we call the final status issues. Nothing was said, the agreement is silent about the status of Jerusalem, about the status of the Jewish settlements on occupied Palestinian land. Nothing was said about the right of return of the 1948 refugees or the borders of the Palestinian entity. There was to be a transition period of 5 years, and these difficult issues were going to be tackled towards the end of the transition period. So why did the Oslo peace process fail? I think that if Yitzhak Rabin had not been murdered by a Jewish fanatic, things could have turned out differently. I'm not saying that the end result would have been a Palestinian state. No, I don't think so at all. But things could have turned out differently and for the better. But I can't prove it because history only tells us what happened. History does not disclose its alternatives. What we do know is that after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, there was an election, and Netanyahu defeated Shimon Peres, this was in 1996, by less than 1%, a majority of less than 1%. Nevertheless, Netanyahu became prime minister for 3 years, 1996 to 1999, and he used his time in office in a systematic and successful attempt to undermine the Oslo Accords, to freeze the process, to stop the process, to subvert it, and to revert to something else, which is Israeli domination. Netanyahu and the Likud never concealed their hostility to the Oslo Accords. Netanyahu repeatedly said, the Oslo Accord is a bad deal. It's incompatible with Israel's security, and it's incompatible with the historic right of the Jewish people to the whole land of Israel. So why did the Oslo peace process break down? The official narrative says it's because the Palestinians resorted to violence. They killed the peace process. And my answer is that the Oslo peace process broke down because Israel, under the Likud, under Benjamin Netanyahu, reneged on each side of the deal. That's why it broke down.
And I think there was, because I was reporting in the region at the time, there was another dynamic as well, which is that so there was a political dynamic, but there was a sort of dynamic on the ground where the most extreme elements on both sides, including the assassins of Yitzhak Rabin, but also Baruch Goldstein and his attack on the mosque in Hebron and the Palestinian response to that. There was a kind of dynamic where you found the extremists on both sides as essentially becoming the best allies and cooperating to destroy any chance of peace.
That was the real dynamic that helped to destroy the Oslo Accords. But it's important for us to remember that after the Oslo Accord was signed, 70% of Israelis supported it, and roughly 70% of Palestinians supported it, because the agreement gave hope. The Palestinians believed that they have signed this agreement. It was just the beginning, but it would lead to an independent Palestinian state over Gaza and the West Bank, with a capital city in Jerusalem. So Oslo inspired hope on both sides. And in fact, this level of popular support continued for some time, and the initial years, 2 years after Oslo, security cooperation between the two sides was very close and very successful, and terror was reduced to virtually zero. So the agreement worked. What happened after the assassination of Rabin is that the extremists on both sides came to power. And I'll give you an example of this change in mood. At the funeral of Rabin, Benjamin Netanyahu went up to Leah Rabin, the widow, and he wanted to shake her hands. And she wouldn't shake his hand because of his incitement against the democratically elected government and against her husband. But Yasser Arafat didn't go to the funeral. It would have been too problematic. But she received him at her home. He came to pay his condolences, and she said she would shake his hand because he represented hope, and Netanyahu did not represent any hope. But the extremists took over on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side, and moderates reinforce one and empower one another, and extremists, as we know from the Islamic extremists, they reinforce one another. And what happens is hope dies and moderation is squeezed.
Yeah, this irony of the extremists being the best allies, the ones who hate each other the most are the closest allies. So it's now 20 years since your book came out, and 20 years since the collapse of Oslo. I mean, Has there been any change in the Iron Wall notion, the strategy? Is it still being pursued by Israel? Do you notice any? I mean, has there been a material change in the setup in the Middle East since your book came out 20 years ago?
So my book came out 20 years ago, and it was 700 pages. But in 2014, I updated the book, and it's not just the second edition. There are 4 substantive new chapters on what happened subsequently. The book covered the first 50 years, 1948 to 1998, and then I updated it by having 2 chapters on Ehud Barak, the Syrian track and the Palestinian track, and then 2 chapters on Ariel Sharon, on his war against terror, returning to militarism, and the roadmap to nowhere, because he didn't want to negotiate. So the revised edition is 900 pages long, and I usually give people 2 pieces of advice. One is, don't buy this book, and 2, if you buy it, don't drop it on your foot.
Well, unfortunately, I thought I was very pleased with myself for having a first edition. Now I realize there's a whole another whole book to read. Wonderful.
But I would like to answer your question on what happened in the last 20 years. So the real landmark, the real turning point was the Camp David summit in July 2000, when there was a Labour Prime Minister, Ehud Barak, a former Chief of Staff, and a disciple of Yitzhak Rabin. And when he came to power, I thought it was a good thing, because he was the right man at the right place at the right time, and if he had a heart, his heart would have been in the right place. And he wanted a final settlement with the Palestinians, but he was a very authoritarian military person, used to giving orders. So he initiated the Camp David summit. Clinton obliged. He and Arafat went to the summit, and he had worked it all out, and he thought he could impose his plan on Arafat. But it wasn't that simple. So and Arafat said to Clinton, look, we are not ready. Our positions are too far apart. If we have a summit and it fails, it would make things worse, not better. And Clinton said, come anyway, we'll do our best, and if we fail, there'll be no finger pointing. Nobody will blame you. So they went, they spent 2 weeks, they didn't reach an agreement, and the summit failed. And the first thing that Barak and Clinton did was to point the finger at Arafat and say, he is responsible for the failure. And Ehud Barak went back home empty-handed, and he came up with the slogan that there is no Palestinian partner for peace. He said, I offered Arafat the most generous offer any Israeli leader has ever made, and he turned me down flat and made a strategic decision to return to terror. So there is no Palestinian partner for peace. This slogan destroyed the Labour Party and destroyed the peace camp, because the Labour Party stood for the negotiations with the Arabs towards peace. If there is no partner for peace, you don't choose a negotiator, you choose someone, a strong leader, someone who is good at killing Arabs, and no one fitted the bill better than Ariel Sharon. So in 2001, Sharon was elected as prime minister, and the Likud has been in power ever since. Israeli society has been moving steadily to the right ever since, and Sharon was prime minister for 5 years, and he was proud of the fact that no peace negotiations took place on his watch.
And of course, he had a long history, as you say. I mean, he had a long history of killing people. I mean, it goes back to his role in the 1950s, for example, was pretty shocking. So Ariel Sharon was precisely the opposite to any potential peacemaker.
Ariel Sharon embodied the most militaristic, aggressive, and expansionist aspects of the Zionist ideology. And he was the commander of Unit 101. It was a commander unit which in the early 1950s carried out all the reprisal raids. And Sharon's slogan was, "A good Arab is a dead Arab." So when he was given an order to go and carry out a reprisal raid, usually it was where the aim of the politicians was to send a message that we can look after ourselves, and if civilians allow Palestinian infiltrators to come into Israel, there would be a price to pay. That was the point of the reprisal raids. But Sharon used to expand the scope, and he committed his first war crime in October 1953 in the Kibriya Raid. Kibriya was a village on the West Bank which belonged to Jordan, north of Hebron. So infiltrators had come into Israel, and he was asked to go and carry out a reprisal raid. And he went in the night with his unit, and they killed 69 civilians. And he said that they didn't know that the civilians, he thought that they heard the shooting and they left their houses. But in fact, his unit blew up their houses on top of the civilians. They killed 69 civilians. This was Sharon's first war crime, but it wasn't his last, because during the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, 1982, when he was Minister of Defense, he was the architect of the war in Lebanon. It was an unjustified war. It was a war of choice, not a war of no choice that was imposed on Israel. There was a de facto ceasefire, but Sharon had a big plan for a new political order in the Middle East. So it was his war, and he was indirectly responsible for the massacre in Sabra and Shatila. And there was the Kahan Commission of Inquiry, which...
in which something like 2,000 Palestinian citizens were killed.
About 2,000 Muslims, Palestinians, were killed by Israel's Maronite allies, the Christian militias. They murdered them in the refugee camp, about 2,000. So this was a major massacre on a huge scale. And the Commission of Inquiry said that Israel was indirectly responsible for the massacre, and Sharon was unfit to be Minister of Defense. So he had to step down as Minister of Defense, but he became minister without portfolio, and he survived politically. And there is a joke that I rather like. Someone phoned the Ministry of Defense after Sharon resigned or was fired, and he said, "May I speak to General Sharon?" The receptionist said, "General Sharon is no longer here." So he said, "Thank you," and he puts the phone down. Then he calls again, and he says, "May I speak to General Sharon?" And the receptionist says, "General Sharon is no longer here." So he says, "Thank you," and he puts the phone down. Then he calls a third time, and he says, "May I speak to General Sharon. And the receptionist loses his temper and he says, "How many times do I have to tell you? General Sharon is no longer Minister of Defense." And the man says, "Thank you. I so much like hearing you say that."
Was that caller you? It wasn't you making those calls, was it?
I wish I was.
Well, to jump forward a bit, because we're getting close to question time. I mean, so the Iron Wall. Wouldn't you? I mean, you'd argue one has to admit that it's been successful. I mean, Israel is a thriving place now for its citizens. It's never been more secure. It's never been richer. And its enemies have never been more disorganized and catastrophic. I mean, so wouldn't we have to judge that it's a success?
The strategy of the Iron Wall was a success in securing Israel. But it's not a success in guaranteeing the future of Israel. Because the reality today is that Israel is a very strong military power, a superpower. I think it's the fifth or sixth strongest military power in the world. It has high-tech technology. It has exports. The main export is military hardware and security services. So it's out there making money. It's never been more secure. Its enemies have never been more disorganized and weak. And the special relationship with America has never been closer than it is today. And since the beginning of the Zionist movement, a basic tenet was to have the support of the preeminent power of the day. There have been ups and downs in the special relationship, not least over the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, which displeased the Americans. But today we have Trump in America and Netanyahu in Israel with the closest relationship, and Trump has done everything that Netanyahu could have possibly dreamed of. Trump recognized Israeli sovereignty over the whole of Jerusalem. Trump moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Trump stopped any American contribution to UNRWA, the UN agency that looks after Palestinians. Trump expelled the PLO, closed and expelled the PLO office from Washington. And more than that, looking at the broad geopolitical picture, what we have today in the Middle East is a new alignment between the Trump administration, Netanyahu's government, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and Egypt, all Sunni Arab states, all lined up against Iran. So whereas Israel used to be the enemy of the Arabs, now Israel is no longer the enemy of the Arabs. Iran is the enemy of both the Arabs and Israel. And the Palestinians have been completely marginalized. But I don't think that the strategy is a success in the long term, because what is Israel's future? Israel is not going to give up the West Bank. Netanyahu said if re-elected, he will annex the settlement blocks. So I have never questioned the legitimacy of the state of Israel within its original borders. What I object to, and what I object to totally and uncompromisingly, is the Zionist colonial project beyond its original borders. And if you look not just at Israel, but at Israel and the occupied territories, you most emphatically don't have a democracy. You have an ethnocracy in which one ethnic group dominates the others. And there is another term for ethnocracy, and that is apartheid. And Israel is an apartheid state, and I don't think it has a future, a bright future, as an apartheid state.
I'm going to open up to the audience in just a minute, but just one last question, which is a horrible question because it's impossible to answer quickly, but can you quickly answer, what's your solution? Are you a one-state solution person or two-state solutions, considering that now within the historic Palestine there's actually a Palestinian majority?
There is no realistic solution, or rather there is no peaceful solution. Most of my life I've supported the two-state solution, and there is the broadest international consensus behind a two-state solution. But Israel, by its policy of settlements on the West Bank, has destroyed the basis for a viable Palestinian state. So a viable Palestinian state is no longer possible because of the Israeli settlements and because they are expanding all the time and because of the wall, the security wall that Israel has built on the West Bank, which is illegal like the settlements. So everything that Israel does on the West Bank is illegal, and the purpose of the Likud is to prevent the possibility of a viable Palestinian state. It's fashionable to say today that the two-state solution is dead. I would go further and say the two-state solution was never born because neither Israel nor America since 1967 have been serious about a Palestinian state. So I have shifted from supporting a two-state solution to a one-state solution because Israel destroyed the two-state solution. And a one-state solution is not realistic. It's not going to come about. But ideologically, I have no problem with it. It's a noble vision. What could be nobler than a state with equal rights for all its citizens?
Thanks, Avi. I think we've got to open it up to the audience. I'm sure there will be some questions. So yes, at the back, we have a mic here. There's a gentleman back on the left there. And please keep questions as short as possible.
Yes, jump straight to the question. And my question is the Palestinian cause a lost cause? Because extrapolating from how the discussion happened, the two-state theories, they're still born. And using the rabbi's note, their bride was taken, they got punched in the face, all their friends are no longer friends with them or strong enough. Palestine was a rallying cry for a long time, but they no longer see it as a viable option. The geopolitics have changed in the area, so is the Palestinian cause a lost cause?
Thanks.
I think definitely not, because all you said is true. They've never been weaker or more isolated. They've never had fewer friends. Their Arab friends abandoned them. Trump doesn't have any time for them because Trump only understands winners and losers, and Israelis are winners and the Palestinians are losers. Yet, and this is a key point, the Palestinian cause is a just cause, and the international community is not going to abandon the Palestinians forever, and the Palestinians are not going away. So we may see better times, but the cause is there, and the struggle will continue.
Let's see. Yeah, here in the front. Prem, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for that very illuminating talk. I have one question. I was in Damascus in 2008 at the time of the Doha conference, which was actually on the future of Lebanon. But I was told that the real point about that conference was, that there had been a 1-year period of quiet, secret talks between Israel and Syria, which had come to an actual agreement. And the Syrians were very unhappy, and they talked to me about it, because it was being unraveled by premature leakages in Israel. What do you know about this?
That the rumors are true, and it wasn't the only time that Israel and Syria came to the verge of an agreement. The first time was under Rabin, who, as a military man, preferred the Syrian track because he thought if he had a breakthrough with Syria, it would change the whole strategic landscape in Israel's favor, and the Palestinians will be left high and dry. And they nearly reached an agreement, but it didn't happen. So reluctantly, so that was the first time. And the second time was, when did you say? This was 2008. And I think that Ehud Olmert was the prime minister. These secret meetings happened. They reached a substantial degree of agreement, and then there were rumors in Israel which scuppered the talks.
Let's see. Yeah, here on the right, please. Yeah. There you go.
Good morning. I feel that the Palestinians have to move away from Sunni Islam. By Sunni Islam, I mean the Arab states.
Do you have a question, sir?
Yes. Is it possible for the Palestinians, who are among the most well-educated Arabs, to move away from the Sunni Islamic states and come to a modus vivendi with Israel?
The Palestinians are very well educated. Sometimes they are described as the Jews of the Arab world. They have a lot of talent, a lot of very able people, and they have gradually moderated their demands over a long period of time. And the climax was the Oslo Accord. They signed the Oslo Accord. They recognized Israel's right to exist. They accepted all UN resolutions relating to the conflict. They are capable, and they have demonstrated that they are capable of coming to a peaceful solution for Israel. The problem is that you need two to tango, and the problem is that there is a serious Palestinian partner for peace, but there isn't a serious Israeli partner for peace.
We have I think, time for one more question. Yeah, sure.
What do you think the role of access to resources is going to play going forward? Access to water with the Jerusalem River, etc., and the dropping of the Dead Sea, for example?
It's a very, very big question, and I'm not an expert on ecology and the environment. The only point I would make is that Israel is in control of the West Bank, including the water resources, and the settlements get a lot of water. The Israelis the settlers consume 5 times more water than the Palestinians on the West Bank, and the Palestinians have to pay 5 times more than the Israelis. So this brings me to my basic point right through, which is the inequality of power between the two parties, and it's the inequality, the asymmetry of power that makes exploitation possible and a peaceful solution impossible.
Thanks, Avi. Is there one last little room? Let's see, at the back there. Yes, this gentleman with the glasses. Yeah. We're really in the very last ending time, so please.
Thank you very much for the chance. Sir, I would like to know as to what is the solution which your mother has in mind. She being 95 years old and has seen all these things throughout, the problems emerging, and now the state where there are. What is the solution that she talks about?
Thank you. What's the solution your mother thinks of? She's 95 years old.
My mother is 95 years old. She lives in Israel, and she's very adaptable and resourceful. So my father, when we went to Israel in 1950, was a broken man. He had lost everything, and he couldn't make a new life for himself. But women are more adaptable and more resourceful than men. So my mother made a good life for herself, and she made Israel her home, and she's a very happy woman.
Thank you so much, Avi. I'm afraid our time is really up, and please give it to Avi.
A big round of applause for Avi Shlaim and Max Rodenbeck for this lovely session on the Iron Wall, Israel and the Arab world, and we hope there will be a solution very soon. Thank you, Max. Thank you, Avi. Thank you.
From across. Mathrubhumi has always been a champion of letters since its inception in 1923. And in keeping with this tradition,
Avi Shlaim will be signing his book. So if you have his book, we will take him there and you can have your book signed and maybe have a little conversation with him. If you have a question, he can maybe tell you.
Is 95 years old. She lives in Israel, and she's very adaptable and resourceful. So my father, when we went to Israel in 1950, was a broken man. He had lost everything, and he couldn't make a new.
.com. Tickets available on Book My Show.
Have you ever been in love?
Have you ever revisited past memories?
Have you ever been loved unequally?
Have you ever wondered what happens to memories when they're forgotten?
Have you ever wished for more than you got?
Have you ever wanted
one more night?
Play Me Live presents One More Night with Meera,
an original audio play by Laksh Datta.
Now playing on Spotify, JioSaavn, Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts.
नमस्कार, जी जयपुर लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल में आपका स्वागत। आपातकालीन स्थिति में कृपया अपना संयम न खोएं। हमारे वॉलंटियर्स और सिक्योरिटी गार्ड्स आपको नजदीकी आपातकालीन निकासी द्वार तक ले जाने में आपकी मदद करेंगे। सभी आपातकालीन निकासी द्वार प्रत्यक्ष रूप से चिन्हित हैं। मुगल टेंट के मंच के दाईं ओर एक आपातकालीन निकासी द्वार और एक सामान्य निकासी द्वार है।